the doors will be closed next time, to give the solo player a stage which is quiet and attentive. To understand the importance of Nikolaus von Bomhard, I think it is not too far-fetched to think about an important opera tenor. Think about Plácido Domingo, and then you know the importance of Nikolaus von Bomhard in his field. Warren Buffett has really put his trust in him. Warren Buffett earned 2 billion euros by trusting Nikolaus von Bomhard. He came to the company, Munich Re. I think most of you at least rely in emergency situations on 2 helping hands. I suppose one is the helping hand of God, and the second is the helping hand of a big insurance company. But how do you know, with God we know, but how do you know that the insurance company will and can really help you? The insurance company can only help you because there is Nikolaus von Bomhard. He is, since 10 years, joining the biggest international reinsurance company at all. She joined this company more than 30 years ago. He took over the managing CEO and chairman position more than 10 years ago. And officially stated, the company was in a rubbish state at that moment. He cleaned it up totally. Shareholders earned billions and billions following his track. Warren Buffett, 2 billions. So this man is at least a successful businessman. But more than this, he is a Christian believer. I do not hope that it disturbs anybody here in the Vatican that he is a Lutheran, a Protestant Christian believer. He is not only a successful man, he is not only a believer, but he is at least, in one point, a wise man. Stop when it is at its best. He has decided, becoming 60 years quite soon, to stop next year, and he would love to share his wisdom with us. Nikolaus von Bomhard.
Well, good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I appreciate that you came after the audience. Second, of course, Thomas was exaggerating tremendously, and now I have a big and serious issue in front of me to live up to the expectation that he has created.
You don't have to sing.
Yeah, they're lucky. You're lucky you. Well, are Christian-inspired business decisions possible? The answer is, of course, yes. But that would be a little bit too fast. So, first of all, let me thank you that you gave me the chance to address you here in this very special environment on a very special day, I think, for all of us. And also co-celebrating with you 125 years of Rerum Novarum and 25 years of Centesimus Annus. It's a special moment, and we all know, of course, certainly the Christians, that the Catholic social thought, the Soziallehre, is the only one that really, through the decades, could live up to the challenges out there and created lots of discussion. And who am I now to talk about issues around that concept? I will stick to what I know that is my business and try to make some comparisons and translate it into my world. The problem is it's also in English, so the vocabulary that they are normally used in English is rather business and certainly not ethics, not at least broad scale, so that challenges me too, but I will live up to it. Well, the question that was put in front of me means practically, is there room at all for ethical and maybe even Christian-inspired decisions? Is there such an approach possible in the economy? Profits first, morals later. That is a common saying. You all know it. And it is not the only duty of an enterprise to build profit. Milton Friedman. I think this is a little bit drawn out of context. It's a little unfair to Mr. Friedman to always quote it, but it's a great quote. And the kind of social Darwinism that we experienced over the last maybe 3-4 decades nurtured, of course, the concept of the survival of the fittest also in the economy. Winner takes it all, leading mentality in many places. However, the recent crises, I think, have revived a discussion that, of course, with the Catholic Church has been much older. And actually, if you talk economy and ethics, it's not a young discussion either. It was actually starting some good 100 years back before the Nazi regime, even in Germany, in Tübingen. There was a gentleman called Gregor Wünsch who wrote the first piece on work ethics and economy and ethics, but that, of course, then in the turmoil of World War II and the Nazi regime did get entirely forgotten. Then the topic popped up again in the US, 70s it started, value shift and so forth, value pays. And then there was a structure and let's say, a concept put behind those thoughts. But that is a relatively young development. And the discussion here was the first time a secular discussion. It was not connected to the Catholic Church or to the Protestant Church. It was secular, but it was ethics. That was new. But how naive do you have to be to think that you can bridge profit-seeking and the Christian-inspired approach? Adam Smith, all of you, of course, know, not only considered him, he was at the time when he came up with his theories a philosopher rather than an economist. So he started from an entirely different angle. He ended up as an economist as we see it today. He created the theory of the liberal market for a reason, to help people, to make lives better. And the invisible hand, the famous invisible hand, had to secure the functioning of those markets. And if you look back today, you would say that must have been some divine providence at work to secure that those markets that he was thinking of work and function. So something had to be balanced there, interests. Today, all look to the legislator or to governments, look for principles, even better rules, because if you have rules, of course, decisions aren't really necessary because they tell you what to do. And religion, I think this is important. That also is a reason why I think the Catholic Church always had every reason to think about and talk about what they did in the encyclica when it comes to the social thought, had experience, because religion long played a role in the economic development. If you look back, maps have been drawn up to see whether there's a relation between the religion in an area and the prosperity of that very area. And over time, and that is, I think, beyond question, the Christian influence states were quite successful, certainly as from the 16th century on. So there is some link, and it worked vice versa with the economic development that then influenced, of course, churches. And I think, and that was for me good to think about that, if you really look back and see when did church and economy meet the first time, I don't know it exactly, of course, but certainly in cloisters. So if you think about monkhood, best educated people of the time, they were the most, not only serious, but also successful economists. The cloisters flourished, some so much that they needed reform afterwards, but the bottom of it was work enthusiasm and frugality. And that together made those cloisters at the time very successful. The pity at the time was, of course, it didn't really influence the outside world too much back then. Another, of course, obvious experience is the dissemination of Calvinism, and more specifically Puritanism, which, of course, strongly helped to influence and develop economies. And it was, again, work enthusiasm and frugality. And here each member of those societies was perceived as being a cloister himself. Each one was the cloister. And they were successful, and they did go out into the world. They were not detached from the world. Some say capitalism wouldn't even be what it is today without Calvinism. And all those individuals perceived their work ad majorem gloriam Dei. Each individual thought it delivers something, and the proof of the quality of their belief was the economic success. There was a link. And very important, by doing what you do, you transcend social classes. It didn't make such a difference where, in which class you were born. That was quite a change. So, a very important development related to the church, maybe not to the Catholic mainstream back then. But one thing is for sure, the decisions of those economic individuals were certainly, I think, inspired, maybe not always in the right direction, by a belief, by church concepts. Of course, also these developments had their extremes. Some things grew wild even, and it changed into a secular world to some extent, because instead of investing, they started to consume, became too rich. Liberalism was born, Manchester liberalism, taking things to the very extreme, came about, individualization, spread out egoism, and from there, that is maybe no coincidence that some of the problems then we experienced maybe more in the Anglo-Saxon world than even in the continental European world. The unfettered market is not a long go from some of these extremer concepts. Then you say, why not having boundless activities, no state interference at all? And déjà vu, the financial crisis is about to come. We also had the other extreme, coming back to Christian belief. If you talk about equality before God, and if you take that demand serious, of course, you extend the concept of equality, and you may end up also in concepts that are socialistic, even though Novum Realm was certainly anything, it was actually the opposite, because Leo XIII was trying to fight those concepts rather. But of course, it is not far-fetched to think that even you can take as a basis the Catholic, Protestant, actually more Protestant even, belief, and build something that is also maybe not functioning too well, but it traces its beginning back to those thoughts. So the only thing I wanted to say with these three examples is that the Christian religion had and still has a lot to do with economies. It influenced us all the time, and it still does today. And the Christians did raise their voice all along through the time. They broadly influenced the economic development, and I think it was good for the world as a whole. But the question now is, what does that mean today and to us? And I think there is certainly, and I doubt there's anyone questioning it anymore, a moral vacuum between here's my private life and here's my business life. This is not acceptable anymore, at least in most of our societies. So what are the principles? Can, should, or must one make Christian-inspired decisions? Is there room for someone? Is there discretion to make those decisions? And what's the framework in which today we think about those decisions? The most important for most of us is, of course, the market. There is a market out there. The market concept is developed. And I think it's not a perfect market yet, but it did get better. Germans tend to pride themselves of the social market economy, not so old as a concept, but we think quite successful because it tries to bridge some of those extremes. Here, profit, there, social responsibility. We tend to think that so far at least no other concept did deliver better, more balanced results. So a well-regulated market, guided by competition, is helpful, is effective to create justice and balance the very different interests that we are confronted with. So competition is helpful. If you want to efficiently use the economic resources and want people to look for better solutions incessantly, it will not work without competition. But, and that is important, the market is no end to itself. It is just a tool. And markets are not perfect, and by the way, nor are they efficient or transparent, at least not to the level that some thought not so far back. So another important thing for those kind of market economies is that they are closely linked to welfare state concepts. It is an essential component of those social market economies that you not only try to secure the physical subsistence, but also to ensure participation and integration into the working life. And that ensures human dignity. And that is what most of the encyclica are about anyway. So the Catholic social teaching or thought rejects the passive state of dependency and the mentality that you as an individual are entitled on state handouts. This is not at the very heart of those concepts. Instead, the aim is to uphold the human dignity by emphasizing the importance of work for the individual. And this is what the welfare state, after all, is about. So free markets need regulation to be a social market economy, and these regulatory frameworks should hinder the undesirable developments and equalize imbalances. And these, of course, these frameworks guide our decisions. So the categoric imperative is, in all that, regulation must ensure that the profit opportunities on the one hand and the risk of loss on the other lie with the same party. And we all experience that wasn't the case. We need intelligent regulation. Regulation should address the critical points of the very industry, of the very subject, without restricting the entrepreneurial freedom too much. And I admit, and if you work in a global company, it's ever more difficult, because those who try to set the standards or to formulate laws on the national level are in a desperate position, because many of the rules or even the laws are prepared on a global level. And you can truly argue whether or not this is legitimate. Take the Financial Stability Board of my world. They have no legitimacy as such, but in fact, they make the law. So many companies, of course, do adhere to laws, and I would say this is not a great achievement of a Christian-inspired business leader to adhere to law. That I would consider the absolute minimum standard. It's rather breathtaking to see that even that minimum standard is broken over and over again. There's a second layer, called a secondary framework of rules and principles around us that also help us to make the right decisions. I call them complementary rules. And I give you examples. UN Global Compact is one. Think of the OECD principles, the ILO conventions, and so forth, and think back to the guilds. The guilds formulated their own standards. Liberal professions today still work along their own standards. This normally is not legally binding. However, companies voluntarily, individuals, commit to those rules. And they restrict what you do, but they do not really sanction the contravention. So if you break them, you may be expelled from the group, but this is it. You're not a member anymore. So you have a choice. We as a company, of course, did sign the UN Global Compact. We have other principles that we follow. In that context, I think 4 things are important for a company if you do that. 1, it should be voluntary. You should voluntarily adhere to those requirements which do not reach the legal standard. And that's a decision you can make or not make. 2, be transparent about it. So if you do it, let people know it and make it measurable. Live up to it. 3, be consistent when you implement it. Either it is for all what you do or it is for nothing. But you cannot have a kind of piecemeal here and pick and choose. Here I use it, here I don't. Use it everywhere. And the last point, the 4th, is the most important to me. Be authentic about it. And that means express your own conviction. And if those standards that you would like to apply do not fit, don't do it. And I admit also, not all the standards are good standards. It takes courage to not do it. Why? There's plenty of consultants out there. They make their living on putting up rankings of people who adhere to certain standards. And if you dare to not adhere, you will be put up in the media and put a tremendous amount of pressure to do it. But if you are not convinced that this is the right standard, don't sign it. And it takes courage sometimes not to sign it. And don't follow trends. That goes still with my fourth point. If you're authentic, you don't have to hide yourself. If it is a trend, fine, then you're part of it. But if you think the trend is wrong, don't follow it. Make that a conscious decision. If you have a value-based approach in your company, you will be well protected to follow trends. You will dissect them. And last point in that context is make it, and I mentioned it briefly, whatever you do there, make sure it affects the very core of your business activities. To put an example out, charity work is great. Charity work is needed. But it does not make all the difference. It makes a difference to many, luckily, but we cannot rely on those activities to cure an unjust economic system or rotten moral standards. It turns into a fig leaf then, because first you break standards, and then you try to make up and compensate with charity work. This is not good corporate citizenship. So that's why I stress the importance of saying ethical standards must be about the very core activities of your company. Corporate citizenship then, in that context, may accompany the business, but the main moral obligation of the management is establishing a sustainable business model and fostering the value-based company culture. And it's incidental, maybe not, that if you today look for young people, and we have a war for talent already in many countries for the demographic change, whether or not you come across as a value-based company makes a difference, makes a tremendous difference sometimes. Young people ask very different questions today than they used to ask in the past. Certainly I did ask different questions. So whether or not you are a reputable firm and that they think that you walk the talk makes a difference. And with the transparency created to social media, they find out very quickly whether or not. So, still, now we have the legal framework, we have the standards, but this is not enough yet. So what values exactly should the company pursue? There's good news out there. First of all, at the global level, the values are not so diverse. Many say they are too diverse, they are influenced by culture, different religions, level of economic development. Of course they are influenced, but they are not as diverse to be used as an excuse not to have them, values. Because for me at least amazingly, if you work in different parts of the world, the standards of business do not deviate so much. There's a lot of Christian content in those. That doesn't come as a surprise, because Christian societies shaped a lot of those business standards and rules for many decades. So if you take the basic ingredients of ethics in business, freedom, equality, justice, security, you find almost all over the place. If you drill a little deeper into what one would call recognized business values, fairness, confidence, trust, reliability, predictability, open information, confidentiality, and so it's a long list, and you can almost go everywhere in the world, they would all agree to those values. So this is not the problem that you say this will not work in that or that country. It doesn't always work, but even if you take the Islamic world with the takaful businesses, except maybe for the ban on interest, it works. We never had issues with people. If we have a breach of a contract, both know it was a breach. We don't have to discuss, because you're from a different world, this isn't a breach of a contract. We knew both it was when it occurred. So the question, I think, once we leave that layer, the next layer is, a company should ask, is what we do legitimate? So it's not legal, it's already legal. I mean, the framework is secured. We follow the standards, next level, legitimacy. Are we doing what we do in a legitimate way? in all markets where we act, in all markets. There's no exception again. Is that also holding true not only for a half year out, but will that hold, in theory, into eternity? Since you mentioned Warren Buffett, he always said, if he gets asked that question all the time, about how seriously you have to take reputational issues, he says, make sure that you are ready to read the famous next day in the newspaper what you did the day before as a headline. And if you're comfortable with that headline, do it. If you're not, don't. And I know reputational issues is the most asymmetric risk you could possibly run into. It's a very small event, and the downside is endless. All the other risks and mistakes are way more symmetric. This is utterly, hopelessly asymmetric. So I would also say if a manager takes big-time reputational risk, you should be deeply worried. So, however, a decision only is a decision, and we discussed it briefly before lunch, in fact, if you have choice and if you have a dilemma. If it is clear what to do, it's still a decision, but it doesn't take much. But if you have a dilemma, I give you 3 examples of dilemma, one of our company, but others. So is it legitimate to manufacture merchandise in Bangladesh, even if labor conditions are far below European standards? Or, as a food producer, am I allowed to use genetically modified feed crops? Now coming to my example, and I had it just recently on my General Assembly in Munich again. As an insurance or reinsurance company, may we offer an insurance solution for a huge dam project in Brazil that gives electricity to millions of people? But of course, you have to relocate indigenous tribes. These questions we have this is a dilemma question. There you have to make a decision. There you need guidance. And you need an inner compass. I think the best way to deal with these issues is to, first of all, make your thoughts and actions transparent. Talk about it. Say what you do and do what you say. And be prepared, even though we sometimes don't like it as companies, but be prepared to engage in discourse. This also means accepting criticism. And the fact that the company is monitored by so many stakeholders out there constitutes a kind of global supervision. We should welcome that. It helps us to not leave the right path. And that regulation can never offer. Regulation can be principle-based, rule-based, either way, but that side of a guidance you can never get from your regulator. So supervision by the stakeholder is universal and very effective. So you yourself involve all those who are directly or indirectly affected by your company's activities. Make them part even of the problem, if there is one. And if I may here humbly quote the Pope, and he worded it wonderfully, the economy, as the very Greek, he didn't say the Greek, as the very word indicates, should be the art of achieving a fitting management of our common home, economy, which is the world as a whole. So the interests of the stakeholders need to be taken into account and kept in balance if a company wants to stay in business. Rerum novarum. This is exactly what that first encyclical was about. So the consideration of the stakeholders' requirements depends on exchange, permanent exchange and communication. And you as a company are only credible if you do that. If you don't, if you're not visible out there and don't talk to the people, I doubt you can build the reputation that people will trust you. Now, next level. If you talk about the management in the narrow sense, now we talk about the visible hand of the manager. Is it possible to implement Christian-inspired decisions? Should, can, or do managers at all want to do that? Should they do it? Can they do it? Do they want to do it? Traditional market theory, and I quoted poor Milton Friedman already, the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, full stop. Now, that's a very straightforward comment. As I said, it's a little unfair because it's taken out of context, but it's a good starting point. Of course I do, and I guess everyone in the room takes a different view. the Christian view and even the liberal economic order sees individuals as a part of a community. And the community organizes itself, the state ensures peace and freedom to act. And this is the framework in which the people and companies operate. And those who take advantage of this framework must take into account the common good. With freedom comes responsibility, and the freedom, we need the freedom, we want the freedom as Christians to decide between good, bad, right, and wrong. We have a responsibility not only for oneself, also for oneself, but for our neighbors and the society as a whole. And this responsibility hits both the company as a judicial organ and the managers. Also the company has that responsibility. And here I can quote an ex-Protestant minister who tends to be the federal president of Germany today. And he worded it also quite nicely, that thought. Anyone claiming an entitlement to economic freedom also has an obligation to act responsibly. So companies and banks, at the time very topical, must of their own accord take account of the impact their actions will have on society. Individual responsibility is not something people can get around by invoking rules or even the lack of those. And this view was certainly reconfirmed, and that's why he said it in the financial crisis, because companies maximized their profit on the short term, but did not fulfill their duty to society, obviously. Consequences we do all know. So we, as companies and entrepreneurs and managers, we must shoulder the risks we take on or create to others. And entrepreneurial action and social responsibility are closely linked, they belong together. So I want to also put out a caveat here, because we sense that specifically on the General Assembly, but also on other instances, sometimes, however, people tend to ask too much from companies. We cannot rescue the world, nor are we the super state or the super government. So I ask sometimes for forgiveness in that regard and say, don't expect unreasonable things from companies. We cannot correct all the mistakes. Although we shouldn't make more, but we cannot save the world. We have our little cosmos in which we work, and sometimes we get overloaded. Now, in coming to the questions of should one do it or can one do it, I talked about the should so far, now the can. The entrepreneurial interest and value-based decision-making are not irreconcilable. There is a tension, of course, and that's why I would call it a decision that needs guidance. There is a tension, yes, but it is manageable, and this is the very substance of a good decision to manage the dilemma. As I said already, transparency is always helpful. Don't sit in your room alone trying to find the right solution. Talk about it, make it transparent, you get feedback, and you make better decisions. And a well-run, value-based company will give its managers the scope to make those decisions. Of course, if the company manages the company very tightly, and here I must say a German business model is a little bit more conducive to making it easier. We have a two-tier board. I, as a CEO, I'm relatively weak because I need the consent of my fellow board members to make decisions. A CEO in the Anglo-Saxon one-tier board system is much stronger. So that helps because you have to talk to others and you cannot make the decisions alone. Another caveat here, because sometimes people are unfair. We as companies deliver services or goods. The consumer out there, and we all are consumers, we have a responsibility too. And the power of the consumer and all that tends to be either forgotten or underestimated. So if you want the lowest price for everything, you start to back unethical economic systems or companies. There must also be some sort of balancing. Every economic decision that we make, if we buy the milk for half the price and are fun of it and say, do you know, go shop next neighbor. All those decisions have moral consequences as well, not only economic consequences. So that's why I always tend to say all market players need to adopt a virtuous approach, not just companies, not just the managers. It's about the consumers as well. The third was the question, do they want to do that? And I think that employers have a responsibility, and yes, I think most today want. One should get a little nervous if people always want team decisions. Team decision, to me, is a first sign of someone running away from responsibility. So a team decision is a wonderful thing. Everybody has a small share in it. You atomize the responsibility, but actually, if it goes wrong, no one is responsible. So that's why I think live up to your very own duty and responsibility and make the decision. You run a risk, of course, but that's what you're paid for. But I think most managers today would accept the fact that they have to and they want to make decisions also on ethical terms. We as managers must make sure that those who report into us find, as I said, the scope, but also the prerequisites to be able to act, and we should be the role models, hopefully. I will not mention names here. The explicit religiously based decision, of course, is a problem. So if you represent on behalf of global companies have clients and employees all over the world. So we consider religion in the company world, first of all, a private matter. So we cannot openly say, this is because we are Christians as a company. We have Muslims in our companies. And I sometimes wonder if I send out Christmas cards, should I write Merry Christmas or should I write my best wishes for the festive season? And then I do receive cards from Muslim CEOs who write about the Feast of the Sacrifice. So you can write to each other, and I love to receive those cards too, but you have to be aware that two worlds sort of come into contact and you should respect the other one. I cannot, even so Munich Re is obviously a Christian-based company, for many reasons I cannot send out Christmas cards to our Arab clients. So the question is, how much of your faith may you as a manager live out there, and where does self-denial begin? Where do you start to become opportunistic or even a coward because you don't talk about it? I think companies should live up to their values, not necessarily openly religiously based, but can be based on religious values. Explicit references to specific confessions or parts of beliefs, monotheistic or not, I think maybe is a little bit too much of a stretch. But you can and should, as an individual, make transparent your very personal background. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that, as long as you live the others with their belief. Make it transparent. This is no problem. I'm coming to the end. I think that entrepreneurial action and social responsibility are no opposites. And that is pretty much common knowledge, conventional wisdom today, but they do rather complement each other, and they must complement each other. And ideally, an economic system and regulation creates an environment that rewards sustainable business practices, and then by doing that also guides decisions for those who don't have the compass. Because you're in an environment where you already shifted into the right direction. The social market economy, as I said, is maybe one quite good system to do all that, and that's why I also think, and here comes the first Christian duty, we should debate the economic systems and we should defend those that we think work. We cannot sit at the sideline and let things happen and not raise our voice if we think economic systems are not conducive to making or creating the right decisions. Every economic system must have a degree of freedom. Luckily, that's where the personal and individual decisions kick in. That is why a value-based corporate policy is indispensable, because there's still so much option space out there. Duty 2, make sure that the business model of your company, the company you either lead or work for, is sustainable and the long-term business approach. And it requires the virtue on the parts of the single persons, the players in the companies, the individuals, the third duty. So you have 3 layers of duty as I see it. 1, make sure that the system is right. 2, make sure that the corporation is right. 3, make sure that you do the right thing. And for all 3, we should feel responsible. And ethical considerations can, should, and must play a role in management decisions. Explicit religious values are difficult to proclaim. Here I would rather caution in a group with global operations. If you work in Munich only, of course, you probably could do it, but even then, today in Munich, we are not all Christians anymore. Therefore, one should be careful, maybe too. In my experience, the scope of universal values is much greater than people admit. And if you take, and coming back to the Catholic social thought, the principles of common good, solidarity and subsidiarity today are pretty much a common, truly common thought also, not only a common good. They are shared among people. And hence my conclusion, I started with a yes, is probably not a big surprise anymore. Yes, yes, yes. Christian-inspired decisions are possible and they can be implemented. And as a matter of fact, I think they are very, very necessary. Maybe in some times like today, a little bit more than in maybe 10 years back. That goes in waves. We always will see those waves. And you can't talk too much about a topic and destroy it by talking too much too. And that's why I really should stop now. Thank you.